Hi, this is Adrienne King, and you are listening to Horror Heals with Corey and Kendall.
Hello, boils and ghouls. It's your old pal, John Cusier, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Welcome back to Horror Heals, where we explore the fascinating intersections of fear, film, and mental wellness. I'm Corey.
And I'm Kendall. In this special two-part episode, we're thrilled to welcome two brilliant minds from Aarhus University in Denmark, Mathias and Marc. Mathias is a leading scholar in the psychology of horror and director of the Recreational Fear Lab, and Marc specializes in the cognitive science of play and curiosity.
In this first part, we dive into how horror influences our psychology, why people of all ages find joy in fear, and what their studies at haunted attractions reveal about the benefits of embracing the spooky side of life.
But don't worry, this is just the beginning. Part 2 goes live on Thanksgiving, where we'll dig deeper into the connection between horror and community, including why horror conventions are surprisingly wholesome and what Mathias and Marc's research suggests about the future of fear.
For now, let's jump in with Mathias and Marc, experts who are here to explain why fear might just be one of humanity's healthiest emotions. And away we go. Welcome to the Horror Heals podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you here today because when we came up with this concept, for the podcast about horror movies and horror culture being good for our mental wellness, it was really sort of a gut instinct. I mean, we'd seen examples of it at horror conventions, but we haven't really explored the psychology of it. So glad to have you here today. And maybe each of you can talk a little bit about where your interest in horror and psychology began.
I'm Mathias, one of the co-directors of the Recreational Fear Lab. Personally, I've been curious about the effects of horror entertainment for a long time. And that interest sort of springs from, personal puzzlement. What the hell is going on? Why am I drawn to slasher movies and Stephen King novels and the scary stuff, the good scary stuff? And as anybody who is or has been a fan of horror or an aficionado will know, there's a lot of sort of stigma attached to the genre. If you want cultural capital, if you want recognition on the streets of academia or, in the higher echelons of fine society, don't tell people you like Stephen King. Don't tell people you like slasher movies. So it's always, and I say always in a sort of considered way, literally hundreds of years, scary stories have been looked down on as something that's morally problematic, psychologically harmful, and aesthetically uninteresting. We have plenty of examples from the 19th century all the way up to the 20th century. Even today, people will say that stuff is bad for you. And there are probably good reasons for that sort of stigma, that sort of bias. But it's not what the science is suggesting. And so in the Recreational Fear Lab, we're interested not just in horror, but all the different things people do to get pleasure from fear, from anxiety, from so-called negative emotion. And some of the stuff we're doing and some of the stuff colleagues are doing is suggesting that there may be significant psychological, possibly even physical benefits to the kind of playful engagement with fear that horror and other kinds of recreational fear offer. So I think that's really fascinating. It's a kind of cool thing.
So Marc, what about your history and with horror? Were you like a horror kid?
Yeah, no, not really. I have never been a horror fan, really. I ran into Mathias. We work on the same university. I'm at the Department of Cognitive Science, and I met this weird horror buff at some point, and he was talking about him doing field work at a haunted attraction. And at the time, I was very interested in sort of cognitive models of development and curiosity and play. in children mainly, actually, these sort of models that are trying to make sense of why it is that children can feel so much joy when they are engaged in certain forms of learning. At some point, after having conducted, I think, one study together, Mathias and I sort of began talking about, applying these concepts to horror fandom. Like maybe the reason that horror fans like horror has to do with learning and curiosity. If that's the case, then at least it would make sense that people not only report, in enjoyment and motivation and engagement when they sort of explore these weird, scary, disgusting, etc. phenomena.
I wonder, Marc, have you encountered, I don't know if you've gone to any horror conventions, but something I've seen more and more of over the last few years are little kids in cosplay and playing and pretending to be horror characters like Chucky or Billy the Puppet from Saw or Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, all of them. What do you think about that?
I haven't gone to any horror conventions, but we've done some studies on children across development and their affinity for recreational fear in sort of a broad sense. We've recently conducted a survey with 1,600 parents to kids between 1 and 17 years old, so we can sort of map the development of their interest in recreational fear. And when I say in this case, we define recreational fear fairly broadly, it's because we sort of, ask parents across a variety of categories if their kid, 1, feels scared, and 2, enjoys X category. For instance, does your kid enjoy watching scary movies while enjoying it? That could be one question. But it could also be something like, does your kid enjoy high speeds that makes them scared while they enjoy it, right? So it's these kinds of questions. And we can see that it's extremely widespread, this appetite for recreational fear in children. They love, going a bit too fast down a hill. They love scary stories. They love playing with the dark. They love chase games, rough and tumble that makes them frightened, all this kind of stuff. And it seems that it is from when they're born. I mean, we are only sampled from 1 year old and older. I think across the entire sample, it's close to 95% of children that report at least one recreational fear activity.
What does it say about me then at almost age 50? I'm still enjoy the going a little bit too fast and with the horror movies and all of that stuff.
Well, that sounds both normal and healthy. As Marc said, we have a lot of data on kids and on young people and people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s, because they often come to the haunted house where we do annual empirical studies. There's only one sort of life domain from which we have no data at all, and that's the nursing home for old people. We don't know if really old people enjoy being frightened. But in your 50s, that's not old. That's the golden age. So I think humans, and Marc will know more about this being an expert on play, but humans play throughout their lives. And I think that's one of the things that sort of sets us apart from most other mammals, or indeed different species of animals that play. It's usually like an infant thing. It's something that small members of a species do to sort of learn about the world, learn about themselves, train their abilities to handle different kinds of social, physical situations. But humans play throughout their lives and get pleasure from it. So it's perfectly normal and healthy, I think, to still enjoy scary stuff in your 50s. What'll happen when you're in your 80s? I don't know.
I'll tell you, it's interesting, and this might be something that you might find fascinating if you have the chance to go to some horror conventions, because the age range of fans is from 0 to 80 plus at these. And I'm not saying that there's 1,000 80-year-olds at the horror convention, but you're definitely seeing some. And it's like there's a woman I'm thinking of in particular who she helps out with some of the horror celebrities, and she just looks like everybody's grandma. But she loves zombies and Night of the Living Dead and The Walking Dead and all of that stuff. So I think hopefully there's an opportunity to get a study going on senior citizens and being scared, why they like it.
You made me think of my father, because he was in no way a scholar, but he was a wise man. And I remember being a child and being really interested in all things horror. Like I said, please buy me the next Stephen King book, and all those things. And he would say things like, why do you think you like it? And he got me to understand, for me, it was just because it was different. I don't know how that makes sense, but it was outside of my normal day, right? It wasn't expected for me to enjoy. So I'm not saying that I was overtly being rebellious or anything like that. I think for me, it was the uniqueness of the experience.
But I mean, developmental psychologists agree on one thing above all, and that is that children are so-called neophiles. They love new experiences. They love new things. They love new objects. And I think it's really helped us, try to sort of tease apart the paradox of horror, why humans enjoy unpleasantness. If you think about it as these, states where these novel states that you don't get to explore a lot, then almost by definition, they have some kind of allure. They have some kind of ability to pique your curiosity.
Can you talk a little bit about the study that's happening at the haunted attraction, how that got started and what the study really entails?
I think about 10 years ago, I was given a lecture to a bunch of people, and one of the people in the audience was a guy who was a nanoscientist, but also who had lived in the US for a couple of years and who had gotten really bitten by the Halloween bug in a bad way. And so he came back to Denmark and he said, we need haunted houses in this country. Halloween had been on the rise for a while. It's not, a native phenomenon to us Danish people, but it has really exploded in the past 15 years or so. So this guy said, we're working on a haunted house. Can you, help us out? Can you consult a little bit, share your knowledge on the psychology of fear and horror? And I said, sure, what you guys are doing is awesome. And so they got their haunted house established. They opened it to the public about 10 years ago. They have their 10th anniversary this year. And then I was fortunate enough to get to talking with Marc about this stuff. And we quickly agreed that we needed to take this wonderful opportunity for a kind of unique data collection. Go to the haunted house, observe people, see what they're doing, ask them about the experience, distribute questionnaires. And so we've been doing that every year ever since. It's a new research project, a new research question every year, a new method. One year we took blood samples from the guests. Other years we have had surveillance cameras and looked at their behavior when they're jump scared. We often do heart rate measurements to sort of get an objective measure of fear. It's just a really cool source of data from people who are experiencing very high levels of fear, but also serious enjoyment. So that's what we do every year, and we're right now trying to put together a new study for this year.
What are the age ranges that are participating at the haunted attraction?
Do you remember, Marc?
I think you have to be 13 to be allowed in, and then I seem to remember that the age range, at least in one of our studies, went up to 63 or something like that in just as participants that we sampled. It could have been even higher. I think it's probably around the early 30s. That would be the sort of median participant, would be my guess. And I think they have a slight overweight of female guests as well.
Interesting.
What kind of other things, horror-related, Halloween-related, have been popping up in Denmark over the last 10, 15 years?
We've always been, American popular culture is huge in this part of the world. Everybody here grows up watching American shows, from Friends to Gilmore Girls, whatever, iCarly. And we watch them with subtitles. They're not dubbed. So most people in Scandinavia, most everybody speaks good English because they watch this stuff and listen to American music. And Halloween was a relatively latecomer. And interesting, something happened in translation across the Atlantic, because we took all the horror elements and sort of sifted out everything else. So I think in the US, people dress up in all different kinds of costumes, like superheroes, or here it's only the horror costumes. So, you go to the suburbs in Denmark on Halloween, and you'll see kids dressed as ghosts and zombies and monsters, not as pirates or Spider-Man, but anything else, I don't know. We all the big American Hollywood horror movies we get here, and like I said, Halloween.
I love your approach because having been raised as a very, very conservative Southern Baptist, I refer to myself as a recovering Southern Baptist. We might have to edit that as well. But I was used to being stifled, in so many ways. And so I love the idea that, people really embrace the horror aspects of Halloween. I always joked when my mother would make me be a scarecrow or something. And I'm like, really? Like that, you're kind of missing the point. I have an affinity for it myself, and I love that.
Can you talk a little bit about your books?
Yeah, for sure. So I've written a couple of books. Probably ones I'm most excited about are the two most recent ones. One is called Why Horror Seduces. It came out in 2017 on Oxford University Press. And that's sort of I'm going to use the word academic monograph, which sounds boring, but that's because it sort of is. The title is kind of sexy, but it's not my title. The publishing house was like, we'll publish your damn book if we can call it Why Horror Seduces. And in our line of work, you don't say no to Oxford University Press. So of course I said, okay, fine, whatever, call it whatever the hell you want. But that's kind of an attempt to construct an evolutionary theory of horror, illustrated with interpretive critiques of a bunch of canonical American horror media, like from Jaws to The Shining and a couple of horror video games. But probably more interesting to your listenership would be the more recent book, which is called A Very Nervous Person's Guide to Horror Movies. And that came out in 2021, also on Oxford University Press. It's sort of an attempt to mobilize all the relevant science to address a number of concerns people might have about horror movies. Like, are they dangerous to mental health? Are they bad for physical health? What about kids in horror? Is the explosion in horror movies that we've seen in the past couple of years, is that a symptom of a sick society? And I tried to write that book in a sort of accessible, readable way. So that's what that is.
Is COVID-19 a factor in that discussion?
Yeah, it is. I mentioned that period, which otherwise should not be mentioned, several times in the book. Also because we did a study during the pandemic, early days, during the first shutdown, where we looked at whether people who watched a lot of horror movies had sort of better psychological resilience or exhibited fewer stress symptoms in response to the lockdown, on the hypothesis that maybe if horror is a form of a medium for playing with fear, maybe you practice your ability to handle fear and to regulate emotion and suppress stress by watching scary movies. And so that's what we found in that study, that the horror fans did indeed seem to have fewer stress symptoms and fewer problems falling asleep and concentrating and so on. So that was kind of cool.
Well, it's funny. Anecdotally, it's not a very big sample size, but I'm an HR person in real life. And I had had several employees say to me over the years since COVID-19 hit that one woman said, well, I was already a social recluse, so that gave me a perfect opportunity to focus my activities in the evening exclusively on those horror films, so it served a lot of purposes during that period.
Yeah, but we also know that the horror box office tripled in 2020. And, during that period where all the countries across the world shut down, one movie was the most downloaded movie in I think in the iTunes store or something, and that was Contagion, a horror movie about a virus killing everyone, right? So I think that's one of my favorite examples that really speaks to this learning paradigm to understand horror, that it's sort of of course everyone knew that Contagion is a fictitious piece of fiction, right? But it still offered the ability to explore an unlikely but not impossible scenario, right?
And I remember hearing about that, and I guess it surprised me a little bit because that would be one of the last movies I would want to watch during a pandemic, especially if you're feeling like you're already living in a horror movie. I'd rather escape to something a little bit more supernatural or fantastical.
Yeah, even something like HBO's Chernobyl became a huge hit during the pandemic, and it's sort of a similar scenario. There's an invisible killer, it's in the air, what do we do? How do governments handle it? But at a remove. So I think even for people for whom the scenario in Contagion was just a little bit too close to reality. There was an appeal, maybe in fictitious depictions of situations that sort of resonated with the horrors that we found ourselves in. I think this learning paradigm that Marc pointed to is interesting also for, any listeners who might be horror fans and be faced with relatives saying, "Why do you like that crap? It's not real. It's all supernatural nonsense or unlikely scenarios." Well, it's probably more complicated than that. Do we know anything about those people, Marc?
I don't think we haven't conducted. Well, there was a bit of it in the pandemic study about the sort of type of movies you see and what that sort of quote unquote trains you for. But we haven't done any like subgenre correlation with any trait or effect or anything like that. But we probably should. And I also feel like this interview is a bit too one-sided because I would really like to hear your opinion on why you think that's the case. And also, I've been dying to ask you guys why you have called your podcast Horror Heals.
Well, I'll give you the quick story. Kendall and I, a mutual love of horror, and that's something we discovered very early on in our relationship. And we'll be celebrating 20 years next spring. And we've been doing a family-related podcast for the last 2.5 years that's dealing with a lot of people with trauma and PTSD. When Kendall suggested doing a horror podcast, it got me thinking about, is there some sort of correlation between the type of people we're already, interviewing and horror people? And I was at a horror convention in the spring, and I was standing in line to meet director Sam Raimi, and there was a long line and a lot of people jammed in, and there was a young man who was very clearly in some sort of duress. He was holding a stack of DVDs, but he was sort of talking to himself and pacing back and forth. And as I was about to ask the people in front and behind, hey, could he step out of line just, until it's his turn, because I think he's kind of uncomfortable, somebody complimented one of the DVDs that he was holding. And all of a sudden, all this anxiety and duress just washed away because he had made a friend. And they were chatting, through the rest of the time in line. They were still chatting as I went up to meet Sam Raimi. And that just made me think instantly, like, okay, horror and healing. Horror is good for our mental wellness. And we kind of already knew that just with us, because horror is a great escape for us. We love just throwing a horror movie on after dinner. Even if it's the same, we'll watch new ones. We'll say like, hey, let's do a classic tonight. So as soon as I started telling people about this, like every time I, give them the one sentence version, I was just at another horror convention last weekend talking about the podcast. And I would say, hey, you listen to podcasts? Sure. I said, well, we've got a new one. It's called Horror Heals, and it's all about how horror is good for our mental wellness. And their eyes just light up. And yeah, it is. It is. Yes, it is. Yeah. That's why. So that's kind of why we're doing it. But we want to just, we want to talk to a wide variety of folks, academics, fans, artists, the people who are making the movies and making the horror art. And it's been a blast so far.
And I think equally, we want to destigmatize, to Mathias's previous point, because it does still have a stigma, and it's sad because there are such talented people writing and performing and directing and producing, and they deserve the credit, that they should get. And so that's important to us as well.
That's a wrap for part 1 of this thrilling episode of Horror Heals. Mathias and Marc gave us so much to think about. Who knew haunted attractions could be scientific gold mines?
Exactly. And we're not finished yet. In part 2, we'll explore the social bonding power of horror, the psychology behind the final person trope, and how horror might just make us better humans.
Plus, if you've ever wondered why horror fans are the nicest people at conventions, you won't want to miss what's coming up. It's a fascinating look into the world of fear, fun, and fandom.
So be sure to tune in on Thanksgiving for the continuation of this conversation. And hey, while you're waiting, why not share this episode with a fellow horror fan or leave us a review? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for joining us today. Stay spooky, stay kind, and remember, when someone asks, is horror good for my mental wellness? You answer, of course it is.